Hello everyone, it's Martin aka Anders, and in today's Computing Competitive we're going to tackle the second leg of Europe's Valorant Champions Tour, specifically Stage 1 Challengers 2, both the open and closed qualifiers. Let's jump right into it. Jumping right into the fray with maps, we see that there's a pretty significant shift in dynamics from what we saw in the first challengers in Europe. Specifically, we see that Haven, which was second at around 22% in the first round, is now up to the first slot at just shy of 26%, and Ascent, which was fourth previously, moves up to a first place tie at that same 25.6%. Split holding strong at the third most played, it shifted less than 0.5% here, so pretty static in terms of its pick rate. And now we have Bain, which saw the most dramatic swing of the group, going from the first slot all the way down to the fourth slot, going from almost 24% all the way down to not even 18%. We have Icebox coming in still at 5th, although with a very pronouncedly lower play rate than we saw previously. Where it saw almost 14.5% in the first stage of Challengers, it drops to not even 9% in this stage. And per the usual here, I don't want to look too much into the sided bias. In many of these cases, we're talking about a 10-game sample for each of these maps, and that's just not going to mean anything. Switching over to agent picks, we see again a pretty significant shift. In Challengers 1, we saw Sova atop this ladder, but this time around, we'll see a pivot towards more what we saw in North America, with Omen taking the top slot, swinging up a full 20% from his position in the last round for EU. Below him, we still have Sova with that very high pick rate, just above 71%. In following trend with the first round of Challengers, we see Raze closely behind. Moving to the next slot though, we see another pretty significant change, and that's that Sage has jumped from middle of the pack at only 40% pick rate to north of 51% and the fourth slot. This is going to be helped in no small part by the deep runs that were had by both OG and Heretics, who both run a very Sage-centric style. The Sage counter-timing playstyle is alive and well, and when married to that high-prevalence Raze pick, it's incredibly terrifying. EU plays, generally speaking, a very slow defaulty setup, and so when you create a composition that walks into that meta and says, alright, you can play your slow default, and when you try to eventually explode onto a site, we're going to have all of this disgusting counter-timing utility that will stall you out even further and make you really have to pay attention to your clock. That's something that is very clearly finding high levels of success in the region. Below her, we have Jet, still showing a very significant meta presence, although 10% down from the first round of Challengers in Europe. Below her, we have Cipher, a little bit up from the first round at 45.5%. Right below him, we see Killjoy almost at a dead tie. Cipher clearly picking up some ground here as he was below Killjoy in the last go-around. We see Breach also losing a little bit of meta presence, falling from around 43% all the way down to 35%. Next up, we have Brimstone, who saw an almost directly proportional loss in pick rate to the increase that Omen saw. So we saw that 20-point swing for Omen. There was around a 16% drop for Brimstone in this case. And there's a bit of subplot going on here that I think marries this decrease in play rate to Breach's decrease in play rate. Obviously, Omen as a controller also brings a very strong initiation tool in his kit. I think that if you look at a lot of the teams that were running Breach in the first stage of Challengers, they were running him with a Brimstone. Ultimately, the surplus in initiation utility that Breach brought to the table allowed them to bring Brimstone more of a dedicated controller that brought a bit of post-plant utility, and they didn't have to worry about having a controller that brings that extra oomph and entry potential to the table. As we see that Breach play rate decrease though, and that ready availability of flashes go down, bringing a controller that also has that initiation option becomes more and more critical. Right below Brim, we have Skye at 13.5%, Viper closely following at just shy of 11%, and finally we'll round it out with the same bottom three as Challengers 1, with Reyna coming in just over 10%, Phoenix just shy of 4%, and Yoru at barely 0.5%. Switching over to compositions, we again see a very marked change of pace. It's actually quite astonishing just how different this top 5 comps is compared to Challengers 1. In Challengers 1, the 1st through 4th compositions all included Breach, and in here there is a singular comp with him. In the top slot, we see something that is very common actually over in Asia, and that's what I refer to as Flashless Double Dive. The only flash it brings to the map, obviously, being Omen's Paranoia, and it bringing the 2 dive agents in both Jet and Raze. In the second slot, we find a tie with Killjoy, Sage, Omen, Raze, Sova, a favorite of teams like Heretics and OG, and the only repeat offender composition on this list in Killjoy, Breach, Omen, Raze, Sova. In the fourth slot, we'll see a variation on that second place composition with Sage, where we're merely switching out the Killjoy for a Cipher. And finally, also tied in that fourth slot, we have Killjoy, Sage, Omen, Jet, Sova, a direct variant of, again, that same composition, but this time instead of swapping out Sentinel, we're switching out the Raze for a Jet. And that will bring us finally to the comp of the event, and it will probably surprise none of you based off of the list that we just looked at. It is Cipher, Omen, Raze, Sage, Sova. I would really not be capturing the essence of this round of challengers at all if I didn't point out the very dramatic surge in Sage play rate, which was really brought to a head in the SmackDown drag-out match between Heretics and OG, 2 teams that very clearly have clung on to this style and made it a staple of their approach. We saw incredibly innovative use of this Sage setup. We saw an instance where a Sage Wall was used to block one of Fnatic's Viper lineups on Bind A site, and things of that level of nuance are very encouraging to me. I've been a critic of Heretics in the past, a little bit worried about whether or not they would be able to take their very Sage-focused playstyle and adapt it moving forward and continue to find success, but the level of innovation we're seeing here and the prevalence that Sage continues to have in the meta is very confidence-inspiring. Of course, Heretics established themselves very pointedly as the dominant Sage-using team in the metagame, and so it will be interesting to see how that matches up against the cream of the crop when we move on to Masters. A short and sweet one today. I'll be continuing to do this kind of computing competitive coverage for all of the VCT events moving forward. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be going into NA Challengers 2 the second I stop recording this. So keep an eye out for those. Obviously, I'll be pushing out other content as well. I've got a mastering macro in the queue that I'm super excited to get out. It covers what is, in my opinion, the most interesting and most individual to me way of looking at the game that I've shared thus far, and so definitely keep an eye out for that. Per the usual, if you're enjoying this content, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment down below. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on the way that the European metagame is evolving. It's a little bit crazy that we saw this much of a dramatic skew between Challengers 1 and Challengers 2, like full-blown metagame shifts, where you go from, here's a Breach meta to here's a Sage meta, and it was literally a matter of 2 weeks. Would love to hear your guys' thoughts on that, and whether or not you think we'll see a similar shift now, moving to Challengers 3 for Europe next week. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.